Namaste, friends, and welcome to the first episode of the India Foundation podcast. This podcast is with renowned thinker Shri Akbar, who definitely needs no introduction. He'll be speaking to us today about his latest book, Gandhi's Hinduism, The Struggle Against Jinnahs Islam, published by Bloomsbury India. This book has been an eye-opener for many of us and gives us a uniquely intimate glimpse of the Indian political landscape in the lead-up to the tumultuous times of 1947, capturing the events and people behind the partition of India, primarily Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Mahatma Gandhi. When it comes to writings on political Islam, there is perhaps no better contemporary author than M.J. Akbar. In this superbly researched book, he takes the reader through that phase of Indian history which has in many ways shaped the destiny of both India and Pakistan. Without further ado, let's dive straight in and listen to Shri M.J. Akbar speak about his book.
Namaste to all of you friends. Thank you very much for being here. There were two principal reasons why Gandhiji refused to accept partition and refused to accept the creation of Pakistan. There were two principal reasons. First, I think I should make a point of saying that all the sources that I have used in the book are original sources. The 100 volumes of Gandhi's collected works, the 12 volumes of the transfer of power papers, which are absolutely stupendous record, as anyone who has gone through them knows that. I've used 12 volumes of Jinnah papers, Azad papers, and that was basically the main source of all the information. There are really no secondary sources. Now, to come back to the two reasons. One, Gandhiji believed very strongly that Hindus and Muslims were the same people in India, born out of the same cultural, civilizational fountain, as it were. So why should they separate? The second reason was, and this is extremely important, has been borne out by history, he thought that partition would not, as was widely argued by even his heirs and those he had created, that partition was not a solution to the communal problem. Instead, it would institutionalize the communal problem and make it into basically a conflict between two states rather than a regional conflict. Now, Gandhiji, who understood both Hinduism and Islam, in fact, he always said that he was the proudest of being a Hindu, believed that the communal problem was basically a creation of the British. Jinnah, who was very Western-oriented, I mean, you all know that, a Western-oriented gentleman, actually believed or claimed to believe that India's unity was a British artifact. Now, Gandhiji's faith was basically the faith of synthesis. This synthesis was evident in his prayer meetings on a daily basis, where he said, Ishwar Allah Tero Naam. And that is why, by the way, since he was strongly of the view that all faiths lead to the same eternity, he was very, very strongly against any conversion. That is why he never allowed his disciple, Madeline Slade, to actually convert. Of course, he was also influenced by, you must never forget, for the first 30 years of his life lived in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, the British, Western Christian missionary movement very strongly believed that they could actually manage to convert all the Hindus of India as easily as they had managed to do this in Africa. Now, Gandhiji continued Pakistan even after the creation of Pakistan. I will quickly give you only one quote. This is a letter which he wrote to Surwardi on 27th October 1947, in which he says, Hindus and Muslims are not two nations. Muslims shall never be slaves of Hindus, nor Hindus of Muslims. I cannot escape the conclusion that the mischief commenced with Jinnah and still continues. Those whom God made one, said Gandhiji, man will never divide. But unfortunately, one man did. But such was Gandhiji's conviction that this almost surreal partition could be reversed. Was that he actually wanted to be in Pakistan on 15th of August. He refused to give any interviews to All India Radio or BBC, saying that he had nothing to celebrate, that this was not true Swaraj. And instead, he wanted to be in Noakhali, protecting minorities. As it so transpired, he was in Calcutta, which witnessed the great miracle of how he protected the East. Famously, Mountbatten said that, I have 55,000 people force in Punjab, and they were ineffective, but I had one man in Calcutta, and he saved the whole of the East. And you can imagine that and in fact, the East was the more vulnerable point, because the great Calcutta killings that happened a year before in Calcutta, in Bengal, and Noakhali had happened. And to protect that region, I sometimes shudder to think what would have happened if Punjab had been repeated in the East as well. When Gandhiji spoke of the civilizational values that united us, he had many things in his favor. One itself was the cultural history of our nation. In a sense, it begins with Khusro, who was born in 1253. I think he was the first person in public who is recorded as saying that I am an Indian Muslim and my answer is in Hindi. And indeed, language as an identity is a very powerful element of our federal system. Gandhiji used to consistently give the example of Bengal, where he said Bengali Muslims and Bengali Hindus both speak Bengali. And then here is something that might certainly interest you, if not amuse you. Gandhiji writes, I think this was in April 1940 in Harijan, that after his meeting and talks with Jinnah, he says when he first met Jinnah, this is many years ago, he thought Jinnah was a Hindu. And when he first saw Vithalbhai Patel, which is Sardar's brother, he thought that Vithalbhai was a Muslim, because Vithalbhai used to have a beard like Alok Bansal and used to wear Turki topi, that fez kind of thing. And very interestingly, as you again, I'm sure many of you know, that Gandhiji's wayward son, Harilal, actually became a Muslim. And Gandhiji told Jinnah that, my son has become a Muslim. What does that mean? Shall I throw him away and send him to Pakistan? Or shall he continue living here? Of course, Kasturba had the best comment on it when she was asked about Harilal. She said, oh, well, I don't know what he's doing. But if Islam can stop him from drinking alcohol, it will be an achievement. For Gandhiji also, the Islam that he saw was the Islam, as he quoted very often from the Quran. He says, the Quran calls Allah Rabbul Alameen, which means the Lord of all creation. It does not call God Allah Rabbul Muslimin, only the God of Muslims. So take what might be called the universal view. Gandhiji used to even mention how Akbar, the poet, used to proudly claim his descent as a Brahmin. He was a Kashmiri Pandit before his family converted to Islam. And this may surprise, I think, many of you. In 1924, Akbar produced Bangedara. It was published. One of the most startling poems in that, and I have put the whole translation in my book. One of the startling translations, one of the finest translations of the Gayatri Mantra is being done by Iqbal. And there he says, he calls the sun Parvardigar. Parvardigar is the term used for, the creator. And I wonder if these days, that would have been condemned by certain fundamentalist mullahs as shirk. Gandhiji was also very heavily influenced in his thinking by Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda. In 1902 or 1901, when he came to Calcutta, he made a pilgrimage to go and see Swami Vivekananda. And the term Daridra Narayan, for instance, comes from Swami Vivekananda. And I think if I had to capture one line that defined Gandhiji's work from Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, it is this: pride in our past, pain of the present, passion for the future. Jinnah may not have been may not have been a Hindu, but he was not much of a Muslim either. I'll just give you, you all know about his dress and his eating and drinking habits. The fact that he never prayed. He's traveled so often abroad and never even thought for a minute about going on Hajj or on Umrah. But here is a story which should interest you. On the day of freedom, we got freedom on the midnight of 15th August, and Pakistan on the 14th. And the original program that Jinnah had devised for the celebrations of Pakistan's freedom was a lunch in honor of Mountbatten. And later on, Mountbatten records in the transfer of papers that Jinnah had no clue that this was in the month of Ramzan. And 3 weeks of Ramzan had already passed. In fact, I wonder, forget Jinnah, any of the Muslim League elite of the time was aware of whether this was Ramzan or not. Among the many sources that I have used, there is one very interesting one. In 1951, the Pakistan government commissioned an author called Hector Bolito to write an official biography. As happened in the official biography, a hell of a lot of it was censored. And there was a Jinnah scholar, a Pakistani Jinnah scholar called Shariful Mujahid, who actually did all of us a great favor, which is he went to the University of Minnesota, and from there he got the parts that had been censored and which Bolito had preserved. And I tell you, they form a very fascinating and insight into Jinnah's thinking, into his habits, into his behavior. He was a man, in Simla, he carried 60 pairs of cufflinks. And on his last flight out from Delhi, when he was traveling on the Mountbatten's plane to Karachi, he actually sneered at the cutlery and the food that had been prepared for him by the viceroy. In contrast, Gandhiji, of course, was the naked fakir who shed his clothes to identify with the poor, the impoverished. And I must also mention, of course, the story of 1931 when he went to the Round Table Conference, and the British officials said that, you can't really go up and meet His Highness, Emperor, Majesty, George, whatever number he was, because you are underdressed. And Gandhiji said, well, if you don't allow me to go in my dhoti, I won't go at all. So the protocol was changed. And when he came back, the press asked Gandhiji that, were you properly dressed? And Gandhiji said, oh, don't worry, the king had enough clothes for both of us. It gives you an insight. Gandhiji had a very interesting, I tell you, almost occasionally a mischievous sense of humor. The thrust of this book is the story from what was known and should be more widely known. One of my great regrets is that despite 70 years of independent, hopefully, writing of history, we still have not made this kind of information common curriculum for all our students. I think, Alok, in the beginning you mentioned that the young might be still ignorant. They are not ignorant out of choice. They are ignorant because we have not told them what we should tell them. And these are facts which are there, I tell you, not from any partisan account, but from the transfer of power papers, comparatively, not totally neutral. But the story of the August offer of 1940, before Jinnah went to Lahore to make his famous call for Pakistan resolution, he stopped by for a secret meeting with Linlithgow, the viceroy. And there the deal was made, where the British promised him that there would be no final constitutional, solution to India's future without taking into account literally a veto by Jinnah. And in return, Jinnah promised the British what they wanted, which was full support in wartime. And of course, Gandhiji, perhaps many call this an error, but Gandhiji refused to support the British war effort because Gandhiji had been betrayed in the First World War and he never trusted the British. But it was this commitment, the British never wavered from this commitment that Jinnah. But there was only one point, one moment. I'm cutting a very long story short because I still hope that you will actually read the book rather than just hear about it. But there was only 1 minute, one moment, one historical moment in this long saga when Jinnah got unnerved. This was after Churchill, who was the greatest proponent of Jinnah and the greatest supporter of partition. In fact, Churchill wanted India to be divided even into many princely states, let alone just Pakistan. When Attlee won his stunning victory, Jinnah was a bit shaken. He still struggled, but after Attlee sent the cabinet mission, and the pressure on Jinnah became so intense that for the first time he accepted a solution for the future of India, which would keep India united. And let me tell you something which I am almost, I cannot be totally, almost certain that you may not have come across this bit of information. Jinnah was actually lobbying to become defense minister in a united India government. Again, please read transfer of power papers. But this cabinet mission plan, which was eventually accepted by Congress, by a Congress Working Committee resolution, that means by Gandhiji, although Gandhiji had some doubts about this, he finally accepted. Muslim League accepted. The Indian media had headlines all over the country celebrating the unity of our nation. It was sabotaged because just at that moment, because a new government would be forming, Gandhiji's heir, which was Jawaharlal Nehru, had to be made the new Congress chief. And in July 1946, Jawaharlal held a press conference completely denying that the Congress had made any such commitment. It was stunning. Azad would later on write in his papers that this was the worst mistake he had ever made, which was to allow Nehru to succeed him. Well, of course, it was not totally Azad's decision, but he had the privilege of a Congress president saying this. He said, and he gives the reason. He gives the reason in his papers. He says it was vanity. It was ego, which prevented Nehru from actually withdrawing the statement in time. Sardar would later call this emotional insanity. Gandhiji did not intervene. And this became the excuse why Jinnah on 30th July then called for a direct action day. Direct action day led to the jihad, led to the violence. And after that violence, of course, we could never, ever come back to the situation. But I want to leave you with another incident or story or fact that on 11th April, 1947, Mountbatten was completing a series of meetings with Jinnah just before the announcement. Now, Mountbatten told Jinnah very clearly the British commitment remained, Pakistan would be given, but he wanted to know whether Jinnah had thought through the meaning of Pakistan. And he said, and I think very viably, he said that why do you want Pakistan? There is a Muslim political dominance across the West in Punjab, where in fact the Unionist Party had for the previous 10 years given an excellent example that the Indian polity could be managed and governance could be managed through unity, but that had been sabotaged in January 1947 by the Muslim League through violence. But he gave the example of how together Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs could run a government very successfully. Then he asked Jinnah over and over again, why did he want Pakistan? Because already the Muslims were politically empowered, they had economically empowered, and so on and so forth. And he did not get any satisfactory answer. And then Mountbatten records in transfer of power papers, Mr. Jinnah was a psychopathic case. Now, just in case you think that this is a kind of remark that can be made in a conversation and will appear in the minutes, it was a practice at that time for the Viceroy to also send a weekly report to London. And in the weekly report to London, very deliberately and consciously, Mountbatten repeats this. Talking of the archives, I'll just end, I won't take more time, but I will end on take a minute more to end. That one of the most interesting and joyful part of this long exercise into investigation and archives was reading the British officials and the wit and candor with which they wrote the official record. Here is an example. In 1944, when Gandhiji was released from prison, he was released because everybody thought he was going to die. Churchill was still in power, and Churchill gave a very reluctant permission for his release only after being told by Wavell, look, this man is dying and the consequences of his dying inside prison, I will not be able to manage. And in fact, I think Wavell simply released. And of course, Gandhiji being Gandhiji, the moment he was released, he immediately started getting better. Went to Pachgani, had a holiday, and his health improved. And Churchill was getting irritated. He was asking, when is this man going to die? At that time, Leo Amery was in charge of India in the British cabinet. And Amery tells Wavell, seeing Gandhi's improvement, I'm reminded of a line from Lord Byron. Lord Byron wrote, my mother-in-law was dangerously ill. Now she is dangerously well.
And with that, we come to the end of this podcast. That was Shri M.J. Akbar speaking to us about his latest book. I particularly like the bit where M.J. Akbar ji speaks about how devout Gandhiji was, and his pride in Hinduism lay in its philosophy of tolerance. How he could not fathom why an Indian Muslim needed to be in a different country to remain a Muslim. But what do you all think? Send us your comments and your opinions about this podcast. Thank you for joining us, friends. We look forward to coming back to you with a new podcast very soon. Watch this space for more.